Good afternoon. Welcome to Columbia Law School. My name is Michael Gerrard. I'm the director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law and a professor here where I teach environmental law, energy law, and climate change law. The Sabin Center is pleased to be co-chairing this program with Columbia's Center on Global Energy Policy. We're kicking off Earth Week with this discussion of how the United States can decarbonize its energy system to move away from fossil fuels, at least without carbon sequestration, to try to avoid the most dangerous climate change. Regardless of the political environment we're in, decarbonization is an essential move, and we all need to move forward with it. Several scenarios have been prepared for just how this could be accomplished. One of the most comprehensive of these is the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, which is a global effort largely organized by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network and IDRI. Here at the Sabin Center, we're helping to lead a project called Legal Pathways to Deep Decarbonization in the United States, which is looking at the various ways that federal, state, and local law can be changed to allow the deep decarbonization work to proceed. So the format is I will introduce each speaker before he or she talks. They'll talk for about 10 minutes each. Then after they have all spoken, I may ask some questions and we'll open it up to all of you for questions. We'll adjourn at 1:30. So our first speaker is Jeffrey Sachs. He's a university professor here at Columbia, as well as Quetelet Professor of Sustainable Development and Professor of Health Policy and Management. From 2002 to 2016, he was the director of Columbia's Earth Institute. He's currently director of Columbia's Center for Sustainable Development and also of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. He was a special advisor to UN Secretary Generals Ban Ki-moon and Kofi Annan on the Sustainable Development Goals and later the Millennium Development Goals. He's been an advisor to Pope John Paul II and to Pope Francis collectively. I can't imagine a higher set of authorities out there. And to many other world leaders. Before coming to Columbia in 2002, he spent more than 20 years as a professor at Harvard. So please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Sachs.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks to all of you. I'm delighted we have a chance to celebrate Earth Day together this way and this week. The facts are relatively straightforward, though the news doesn't permeate Washington, but the real tasks of what we need to do are quite understandable, from the science to the engineering to the public policy. The issues from a scientific point of view are really not in dispute in a scientific manner, and that is that human activity is rapidly warming the planet and changing the climate more generally. We've, through anthropogenic effects, raised the average temperature relative to the pre-industrial level by around 1.1 degrees C. We are on a trajectory of several degrees warming, and all of the evidence from ecology, agronomy, earth dynamics, including sea level, storm events, is that this would be reckless and dangerous to proceed as we are proceeding. One example of disastrous consequences, the observation emphasized especially by James Hansen here at Columbia, that the last time Earth was close to 2 degrees C warmer than pre-industrial, in other words, less than 1 degree C from where we are, the sea level was 6 meters higher than now. That was in the Eemian epoch 130,000 to 115,000 years ago. In other words, we're on a path that gives a real risk of massive disintegration of the West Antarctic ice sheet and loss of Greenland ice sheets to the extent of several meters sea level rise. There are many, many other consequences, and in the dryland regions of the world, we're already seeing them in terms of falling crop yields, increased food instability, longer and more intensive droughts, and lots of displacement of people with onsets of conflict and violence in many of these cases. The engineering is also clear that the answer to this is a transition to a low-carbon energy system by mid-century. This is based on the best estimates of climate sensitivity and the so-called carbon budget, how much CO2 can yet be put into the atmosphere with a high likelihood of staying in a even moderately safe climate zone. And the answer is less than 25 years at the current emissions rates, meaning that we essentially need to phase out net greenhouse gas emissions by around mid-century. This is the essence of the Paris Climate Agreement. It calls for staying well below 2 degrees Celsius and aiming to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's universally adopted by every single member state of the United Nations, plus 3 more signatories, Cook Islands, Niue, and the EU. That makes 196 signatories. It's a unanimous view of the world of those signatories that we ought to do this. In order to achieve that, we need basically 3 things. One is a transition to zero carbon power. That means essentially wind, solar, geothermal, hydroelectric, nuclear, or nearly 100% carbon removal from CO2 thermal plants, so CCS. Those are the options. There are many smaller options as well, ocean currents, biofuels, and so forth. But basically, it is to move to zero carbon power generation. It's to move to electrification of everything that can be electrified. Teslas for all, if you want to put it that way, but that's where we need to go. We should not have internal combustion engine personal mobility after 2030. There's no need for it economically, and we should be aiming for basically a zero emission fleet. Could be some hydrogen. That's Toyota's betting on that. It's most likely to be batteries, in my view, as well as, of course, public transportation, and even good old walking and bicycling will make a rebound in urban settings where most of the world will live. As you know, Elon Musk announced last week electric trucks to be unveiled this fall. I've spoken to him recently. He believes that electric aviation is within reach. I didn't ask him for a precise timeline, but he says that that too is within reach as battery weights continue to come down per kilowatt hour of power. But the point is zero carbon power generation combined with near universal electrification, combined with smart systems, integrated grids, energy efficiency that enable us to deploy these new technologies at lower cost. We've modeled this for the United States a couple of years ago, and I know Karl is going to talk about a new report that's based on the scenario that was just released. This is all feasible. It doesn't cost very much. It would create many more jobs than would be lost in the small numbers of those who still remain coal miners. This is a tiny, tiny issue, though it's made into obviously a big political issue. last point before I sit down is to say that I believe that this will happen. I don't think that Donald Trump and his cronies can stop this. What is happening now is not a debate. It is the last gasp of extremely nasty industry. The oil and gas industry, especially in its leading figures like the Koch brothers, Exxon and Chevron, have been among the worst behaviors in American corporate history. They rival the tobacco industry, and they have hired the same PR staff to create doubt, confusion, and the Koch brothers to buy up most of the Republican Party. They've succeeded in the short term, but they cannot actually stop the process. It's just too mind-bogglingly stupid and lying what they're doing. And nobody believes it's the truth, even when they utter the words. A man like Scott Pruitt is a hack of the worst degree. He should go home to Oklahoma, apologize first to the American people, and then go home. He's been on the payroll of the oil industry his whole life. He is a hack, and it's disgusting. I don't think they'll get away with it, because to get away with what they want would require people pouring tens or hundreds of billions of dollars into losers. And I don't think it's going to happen. They'll get some suckers. But if you're thinking about investing in the Keystone Pipeline, you will go broke. I would not buy their bonds. There is absolutely no use for this investment, no conceivable way that it's going to be carrying oil sands from Canada 20 years from now. It will close down. Probably it will never get started. And take note that Statoil, Shell, ConocoPhillips have all sold their oil sand holdings in the last 2 months, and Chevron is about to do the same. And this is a good indication that that's a loser. And second, take note that Tesla has a market cap that is now greater than GM and greater than Ford, and that is a hint of where we're really going. So don't let Trump get you down. He's a liar, he's an ignoramus, and he's not going to get his way.
How do you really feel, Geoff? So our next speaker is Dr. Karl Hausker. He's a senior fellow at the World Resources Institute, their climate program. He leads analysis and modeling of climate mitigation, deep decarbonization, and the social cost of carbon and power sector policy. He's worked for more than 30 years in the fields of climate change, energy, and the environment, in a career that has spanned legislative and executive branches, research institutions, NGOs, and consulting. From 2007 to 2013, Karl was vice president of ICF International. He worked in India in 1999 as a visiting fellow. He worked for President Clinton as Deputy Assistant Administrator in EPA's policy office, and he represented EPA in various interagency fora and COP1. He also served as chief economist for the U.S. Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources when it was under profoundly different management. Karl.
Thanks, Michael. Yes, I've come a long way since working on the Hill in the late 80s and the early 90s when it still functioned to some extent. Really appreciate the chance to be here today and talk about the latest report by the Risky Business Project. Many of you probably are familiar with the Risky Business Project. In 2013 or 2014, it released its first report that was the most detailed, granular look at the physical impacts of climate change that were coming to the U.S. and a quantification of the economic impacts. Last year, late in December, they followed it up with a mitigation study, a look at what does it take to decarbonize the U.S. energy sector between now and 2050. And so both of these reports are available at the Risky Business website. I'm going to give you a very quick overview of this latest study on deep decarbonization. I urge you to go up on the website. We have a huge, wonderful amount of material and interactive graphics that go into much more depth than I possibly can today. I'll tell you the analytic approach we took. As Geoff said, this study is actually related to the Deep Decarbonization Pathways project in the sense that it uses an updated version of the same model that was used in that round of studies several years ago. What we did was take the Pathways model and updated it with a new reference case, keying off of the EIA 2015 reference case, and also explored 4 different ways that we could decarbonize the energy sector. Just a couple caveats. There's a lot of different kinds of models out there. This is sort of a pure technology pathways model that will tell you not only how to get to the goal, the emissions goal you want, but will give you the first order estimates of cost, changes in technology costs, capital costs, changes in fuel costs. It is not a full-blown economic model, so it doesn't project GDP and employment. Those are advantages of those types of models. One of the advantages of this type of model is a lot of granularity in how you meet specific end-use demands in the economy, different pathways you can take to get there, and a very careful look, particularly at the power sector, where you have to carefully balance load every day. And as you go into very heavy use of renewables, that task becomes more complicated. It's doable, but it becomes more complicated. The target we set for deep decarbonization was an 80% reduction in CO2 emissions from the energy sector. Of course, that's just part of the problem. And later, Judi is going to describe a study done by the Obama administration which looked at all 6 greenhouse gases. So be aware that we just looked at the main chunk, the CO2 from the energy sector. Second, we looked at how do we do this with existing or near commercial technologies. That's a constraint on the modeling. We did not assume that batteries could fly airplanes, which might happen in the future, but there's a conservatism here in looking at technologies that are near commercial or already commercial. We also used an assumption that we're going to allow capital stock to turn over naturally at the end of its lifetime. That keeps costs down, but that means you can't achieve emissions reductions as quickly. But going back to the 80% number, I want to key off something that Geoff highlighted too. 80% reduction was kind of the Obama soft long-term emissions target for many years, but we also know, based on the latest science and the discussions coming out of Paris, that is probably the minimum of what we have to do. We may need to go to 90-95% reduction on the path to ultimate full decarbonization of the economy. So in that sense, this analysis shows the minimum of what we may need to do. So, a snapshot of the results. Again, very interesting parallel to what Geoff said. There's really 3 basic tasks you have to do to decarbonize the economy. You need to switch as many end uses as possible from fossil fuels to direct use of electricity or the use of fuels derived from electricity, such as hydrogen or synthetic gas. Second, you have to, of course, if you're going to generate all electricity, decarbonize it. Third, across the whole economy, try to be as energy efficient as possible. These are the 3 pillars that pop up in any study of this nature. They're very, very consistent. I'm going to describe in a minute the 4 pathways we modeled, but just focus on one pathway, how we did that on the end-use switching. Right now we have about 23% of total end-use demand is met directly by electricity. In our pathways, we could more than double that to over 50%. The decarbonization of the power sector, we can go from over 500 kilograms CO2 per megawatt hour to take that down to almost 0. And finally, we can increase the energy efficiency of the economy by more than 2/3. What does that mean for the big picture primary energy use in our pathways. What this graph shows is the current fossil energy use in 2015 and where we think we can get it down to by 2050, and then what happens to your non-fossil energy use and your fuels derived from electricity like hydrogen. Currently, not surprisingly, you have big chunks of gas, oil, and coal, and at about 75 quads per year. In our sort of central tendency pathway, we call the mixed resources pathway, coal is almost eliminated. Petroleum goes way down and is largely used for, we're still flying airplanes and doing some heavy duty trucks with it. Natural gas continues to be a significant source both in industry and in burning gas with carbon capture in the power sector. And then kind of the flip side, we see our current use of uranium as a fuel and biofuels, solar and wind. All of those increase significantly by 2050. However, we get rid of ethanol, which is probably the worst fuel ever invented by humankind, and we have the use of biofuels. We have a fairly optimistic assumption about how much biomass is available to use, and that's something we could talk about during the discussion period. Here, I'm going to look at the power sector and the transport sector as the two most important sectors in terms of how we played with different pathways to get there. And I want to emphasize again, there's no silver bullet. There's no one way to get there. They're very important choices we have to make, both collectively and also driven by market forces and costs on how to get there. I'll describe the four pathways very briefly. We have a pathway in which we have relatively high use of carbon capture and sequestration on both gas and coal plants. We have a scenario in which we use relatively high, large expansion of nuclear energy. We have a pathway in the power sector with relatively high use of renewables, and then what we call the mixed resources pathway, which is kind of the most balanced blend of those three major categories. Each of these is coupled with a technology scenario for the transport sector, which we'll flip to in a minute. But with the high nuclear scenario, we run nuclear plants flat out, and in periods of low demand, we use that electricity to generate hydrogen. So we have a high use of hydrogen in the transport sector in that pathway. In the high renewables pathway, we're using surplus peak power to recharge electric vehicles. And again, this is we need to figure out some way to balance our expanded power system and the patterns of generation with a transport system that has to rely on either electricity and or synthetic fuels. So when you look at this and we see that here's a reference case forecast for 2050, the first thing you notice, of course, is you're generating a lot more power. That's that switching of fossil fuels to electricity, electric fuels, and the composition of the different power sources again varies and is dependent in part on what's happening in the transport sector. Just to give you a flavor of what's happening in the model, we model all 9 regions of the U.S. All this is up on the website in infinite detail, but interestingly, the model builds solar in the Southwest, it builds wind on the plains, it builds nuclear in the most regulatory friendly climate, so the South Atlantic, Southeast, lots of good granularity there. In the transport sector, here's our reference case dominated totally by petroleum with a little bit of ethanol up there. The first thing that strikes you about this chart is the transport sector has become much more efficient. That's that third pillar of decarbonization. You can reduce your quads by over 10 quads of energy use by being more efficient. And then you see mixtures of hydrogen and renewable diesel. You see a lot of electricity here with biogas. And again, these are coupled with what's happening in the electricity sector. What does this cost? I'm in total agreement with Geoff on this. This cost is manageable. It is not free, but nor is it going to be the end of Western civilization. This bar graph gives you decadal averages for the 2020s, the 2030s, the 2040s. What do we need to invest in clean energy in the blue, and what kind of fossil fuel savings are going to be racking up on an average decadal basis? We would need to invest about $200 billion above base case during the 2020s. That will grow to about $400 billion in the 2030s, ramp down to the mid 300s by the 2040s. And the fuel savings just grow exponentially. Not only the quantity of fuel is being saved, but also as fossil fuel prices tick upward over the next century, you get that double effect of price too. Is 200 billion, 400 billion a big number or a small number? One good way to put it in context is we currently have an economy of about $19 trillion, and it's going to keep chugging along unless President Trump totally tanks it, which he promises not to. We currently spend over $3 trillion on investment. Typically, we spend 15 to 20% of GDP on investment. So if you're spending over $3 trillion on investment anyway, and we need to increase to tackle the greatest environmental challenge we've ever faced, that's a small increase in investment as a percent of GDP. It's about 1% of total GDP. This is completely manageable. In the interest of time, I'm going to just flip through these charts. We took the decadal averages you just looked at and break them down by what are we investing in and what kind of fuel are we saving. The fuel savings are dominated by petroleum, not surprisingly, and we can also do that on an annualized basis. Let me just talk very quickly about the implementation challenges involved in this. It's technologically feasible. It's economically completely manageable in terms of cost. But there are implementation challenges. Some of those are very much of a political nature. Pick your favorite power source. Nuclear, CCS, renewables, some of the above, all of the above. Whatever path we go forward, we have to build a lot of power plants. We have to build them at a rate 2 to 4 times higher than some of our highest historical rates. We have a large NIMBY problem in this country. Nobody wants to build anything anywhere near them. Similarly, we need to expand the transmission and distribution system to electrify the economy. It's very hard to build transmission lines. So, particularly my message to the environmental community is if you're serious about addressing climate change, you have to reduce NIMBY in this country. And that goes for natural gas pipelines too. We got to build a lot of infrastructure, and we need to do it fast. Shift to electric vehicles or hydrogen vehicles creates some very interesting challenges. We need to think about how we charge them. Do we do them with fast chargers, slow chargers, workplace, home? Can we do battery swapping? That's something that we probably need to do some planning and collective decision making on, because it's very hard for that to be called out purely by market forces. Finally, utility business models need to change too. That's already underway, given some of the turmoil in the utility industry. But ultimately, this is a tremendous growth opportunity for utilities, for IPPs, for rooftop solar installers. This is a tremendous growth opportunity. The flip side of that, of course, is there are going to be disruptions in the oil sector, the coal sector. Gas will probably continue to be a transition fuel. And again, if we collectively choose to do this, we need to collectively provide job training, transition assistance to those communities that are affected. So thanks. I look forward to the discussion. And I'll turn it over to who's next.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Karl. We'll now hear from Jeffrey Heel. He is the Donald C. Waite III Professor of Social Enterprise at Columbia Business School. He does a great deal of work in economic theory and resource and environmental economics. He's the author of 18 books and about 200 articles. He's a fellow of the Econometric Society, past managing editor of the Review of Economic Studies, past president of the Association of Environmental and Resource Economists, recipient of its prize for publications of enduring quality, and a life fellow there. And he's a director, among other things, of the Union of Concerned Scientists, and founder and director and chairman of the board of the Coalition for Rainforest Nations. Geoff Heel.
Thanks. I'm going to give you a somewhat different perspective on decarbonization for the US economy. I don't disagree with Karl's conclusions, but I disagree with some of the details. I'll give you a slightly different perspective on this. Specifically, just to jump ahead, I think the scope for energy efficiency is widely exaggerated. I think that the potential role for carbon capture and storage is greatly exaggerated. And I think the potential of biomass is exaggerated. So I've thought about how to decarbonize the US economy in the light of those observations. I can skip a lot of the slides I've got in here, actually. Basically, I've looked at this. This is the current sort of breakdown of US power production. We've got to do something. Let me back up. We've got to do two things, right? As both Geoff and Karl said. We've got to decarbonize the electricity supply industry, and we've got to decarbonize transportation. If we can do both of those, then we're a long way towards reducing emissions very significantly. So I'm going to focus on those. So of the current, electricity output is measured in terms of megawatt hours per year. And of the current output of megawatt hours per year, 33% comes from coal, 33% comes from gas. And the rest comes from a variety of sources, as you can see there. So what I've done is calculate what it would cost to replace the 33% that's produced by coal, the 33% that's produced by gas, by wind and solar. No fossil fuels at all would be left. And I don't run up nuclear either. I just keep nuclear where it is and assume that nuclear power stations are replaced when they expire. And everything else stays constant. So what would it cost us to take out 33% of the output that comes from coal, 33% that comes from gas, and replace them by an even mixture, 50-50, of wind and solar? Now, in order to do that, we have to do some calculations. It doesn't require a big, complicated computer model. You can do it on a fairly straightforward Excel spreadsheet. Although not if you want to go into the kind of detail that Karl went into, but if you want to get big picture answers, you can do this actually with a pencil and paper. So in order to do this, we need to know, roughly speaking, how much capacity we have to build for wind and solar. To do that, we have to know what are called their capacity factors. So, one megawatt solar plant doesn't in general produce 1 megawatt of output. It produces some fraction of that because the sun doesn't always shine and so on and so forth. So the capacity factor for solar is roughly 25%. The capacity factor for wind is roughly 35%. Wind doesn't always blow at maximum capacity and so on. I've got here the capacity factors for wind and solar according to the Energy Information Agency, 32.5% and 28%. So from that we can work out how much wind and how much solar we need to build to replace the 33% wind, coal and 33% gas. Once we've got those quantities, we need to work out what that will cost. And here I got figures again from the Energy Information Agency for the cost of wind farms, $1,700 a kilowatt, and the cost of solar installations, $1.91 per watt. Those are both the Energy Information Agency figures published in 2016 for 2050. So they're somewhat out of date. These numbers drop quite quickly. And going forward, they will almost certainly be significantly lower than those. But in order to be very conservative, I've used the EIA figures, which are backward-looking rather than forward-looking, both for capacity factors and for costs. In practice, so I've costed this whole thing out using the EIA figures, and here you have the number there, $1.793 trillion is what you'd have to invest in generating capacity if you wanted to replace both coal and gas by wind and solar. That's under the EIA figures. If I use slightly more optimistic figures, $1,500 for the cost of wind and $1.25 for the cost of solar per watt, this comes down to $1.35 trillion. And those figures, 1,500 and 1.25, I think are sort of accurate for right now, maybe last year. Going forward, those figures will almost certainly be too high. Using even more optimistic figures, $1,500 for the wind, $1.25 per watt of solar, and a 38% wind capacity factor, as opposed to 35%, which the EIA takes. the number comes down to 1.25 trillion. Anyway, so basically we're looking at a cost, an investment cost for replacing capacity of somewhere in the region of 1.25, 1.25 trillion to 1.75 trillion. Okay, so it's a reasonably large sum of money.
30 years, or
That will be between now and 2050. Yeah. That's a reasonably large sum of money, but as we spread it over 34 years, it actually will turn out to be quite manageable. So that's the cost of the replacement for the fossil fuel generating stations. Now, if we're going to rely heavily on wind and solar, we have to build out the grid quite a lot. Because the best wind resources in the US are on the high plains. Not much of the demand for wind is on the high plains. You have to build out the grid to get from the source to the sink. Likewise for solar. So I've assumed I can't find any clear estimates of what we need to do here exactly. So I've assumed that we have to extend the grid by 25%. So we currently have 200,000 miles of transmission capacity, high voltage transmission. I've assumed we build another 50,000 of them. And that costs you on average $2 million a mile. So that gives you $100 billion. So $100 billion for building out the grid, which actually is a drop in the bucket by comparison with 1.25 trillion. It really doesn't make an awful lot of difference. Then we get to the issue of storage, which actually turns out to be a very big issue. If you're going to rely heavily on wind and solar, you have obviously an intermittency issue. Solar, to state the obvious, doesn't work very well at night, and the wind doesn't always blow. Fortunately, the wind blows more at night than it does during the day, so there is some sense in which wind tends to offset the fluctuations in solar, but that's by far from a perfect negative correlation there. So we need to build out an awful lot of storage capacity if we're going to be reliant on wind and solar to the extent of 66% of our generating capacity. So I've done some calculations of what it would take to build up our storage capacity, and that unfortunately turns out to be very, very expensive. The biggest capital cost I see going forward, if we follow this scenario, is the cost of energy storage, not the cost of generating capacity. Okay, so currently, Elon Musk, Saint Elon perhaps, is quoting $300 a kilowatt hour for his battery packs. So if you want to buy his power walls, you pay him about $300 for a kilowatt hour of capacity. That's high. He's paying himself about $195 for the battery packs that go into his Teslas. And people generally expect the cost of battery packs to come down to something like $150 a kilowatt hour within the next couple of years. There's one company selling grid storage capacity for about $150 a kilowatt hour at this point. But anyway, there's some uncertainty about what the cost of battery storage will be going forward. There's also some uncertainty about the amount we will need. But this calculation here instantly just gives you the following information. Suppose you build a wind turbine with 2 megawatts of capacity, which is a typical medium to small turbine. This thing would cost $3.4 million. Enough storage capacity to store 1 day of output would cost $4.68 million. So if you wanted to store 1 day's output from a wind turbine, you'd pay more for the storage than you would for the wind turbine itself. And here's a 10 megawatt solar installation. That would cost $19.1 billion at the EIA prices. And if you wanted to store a day's output from that, it would cost you $20.6. So you can see that bringing in enough storage capacity to store the output of these renewable resources for 1 day effectively doubles their capital costs. Okay, now that's I'm taking $300 a kilowatt hour there, which is the price that Musk is quoting for his Powerwall battery packs right now. You probably halve that in a couple of years from now, but it's still a significant number and a significant capital cost. Now, we don't really know exactly how much storage we will need in a world where we're relying on intermittent renewables to the extent of 66% of capacity. In the calculations, I've assumed that the answer to that is 2 days of output. We need enough storage to store 2 days of output. There's no particular rationale for that number. It's hard to work out exactly what is the right level of storage. You need to know a lot about the statistics of the intermittency of wind and solar in order to do that calculation, and that data isn't very, very readily available. So I've assumed two days of storage capacity. And if we do that, we get this is the total cost we get here. I've got sort of best case and worst cases in these two columns here. Building out the capacity would cost around about $1 trillion. In the best case, $1.75 trillion in the worst case. Transmission, 100 billion. Storage, best case, 2.2 trillion to 4 trillion. So storage is more expensive than generating capacity. The gross investment total would be either 3.3 trillion or roughly 6 trillion here. We've got some offsets against that. We save a lot of fuel because we're no longer using gas or coal. So we save a lot of fuel, and the fuel savings over the life of the project would be 0.96 trillion, effectively $1 trillion offsets there. There's also a lot of plants we have to replace anyway. So I think that's a fair offset as well. If a coal plant comes to the end of its life, it has to be replaced. So charging the replacement of that to the aim of removing CO2 emissions is inappropriate. So we can offset again the costs of fossil fuels. Luckily, every fossil fuel plant in the United States, every single one of them, will need replacing between now and 2050. So we can write off the capital costs of all those replacements against the gross cost, the gross investment that we need. So when you do that, you get a net total, which is actually relatively low, 1.28 trillion on the best case, or 4 trillion on the worst case. And I think on the whole, that's what I call the best case here is actually going forward the more realistic case. As I said, the worst case is taking the IEA prices, IEA costs, which are backward-looking costs, averaged over the last 3 or 4 years. And it's clear that costs today are significantly less than they were 3 or 4 years ago. And it's also clear they're likely to continue to fall. The really big unknown, I think, is going to be the cost of storage. If we take these numbers and we put them in sort of per year form, we get anywhere from about $40 billion a year to $135 billion a year. That's net. So I've netted out the fuel savings, I've netted out the plant replacement costs. The best case then is extremely affordable, because last year, 2015, we spent $42 billion on new electric generation capacity, which is more than enough to do what we need. The worst case is roughly a three times increase in spending on generation capacity. In either case, it's well under 1% of US GDP, well under 1%. So in that sense, I'm totally agreeing with Karl. And I'm with Geoff. It's a very affordable indeed. And it's affordable. Let's talk about why it's affordable. It's affordable largely because actually solar and wind are less expensive than the fuels they're replacing. If you look at wholesale markets today, the cost of power from coal is sort of 6-7 cents a kilowatt hour. The cost of power from gas is 5 or 6 cents a kilowatt hour. The best wind power stations are 4 to 5 cents a kilowatt hour. Some of them even as low as 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour. The best solar power stations are about 3 to 4 cents a kilowatt hour. So solar and wind in their best locations are actually cheaper than the fuels, than the energy sources that they're replacing. So it actually makes sense. This should not, in fact, be an enormously expensive undertaking. And as I said, every fossil fuel plant in the US will expire, will reach its sell-by date before 2050. So we don't actually have to scrap any existing fossil fuel plants early. And that, when a lot of perspectives on this, one of the major costs is scrapping fossil fuel plants early. Okay, so that's the US, and that's replacing fossil fuels in generation. We've got a tougher problem in decarbonising transportation, and I don't have a lot to say about that. Obviously, we have to replace all internal combustion engines by battery electric vehicles by 2050. Vehicles last on average about 15 years in this country. So we've essentially got 2 vehicle generations between now and 2050. Which means that by about 2035, we have to be selling only battery electric vehicles if we're to get the entire stock of vehicles to be battery vehicles by 2050. So, will electric vehicles have 100% of the market by 2035? Frankly, I kind of doubt that. And I think they'll have a significant piece of the market, but how big that is, I really don't know. This is one of the biggest unknowns. There's not much cost associated with this incidentally. People we rely on people voluntarily choosing electric vehicles over internal combustion engines. There's no sort of social capital being invested in this. We're replacing the gasoline distribution system by an electric distribution system, but that's not particularly expensive. And every gas station in the US has high voltage electric power because they need it to run the power, the pumps and so on. So it's relatively easy to put gas stations to charge cars. So there's not a huge capital cost involved in that at all. The question is, how fast can we persuade people to give up the conventional internal combustion engines and replace them by electric vehicles? Tesla's doing a great job on that, but there are still obstacles to this. Charging it still takes a long time to charge an electric car, or you have to use one of these superchargers. But anyway, that's I think the big unknown here. I think we can easily and relatively cheaply decarbonize our electricity generation system. It's more challenging to decarbonize our ground transportation system. And I don't see batteries in aircraft anytime in the near future, I'm afraid. That seems very eminently optimistic on Mr. Musk's part. Then if he weren't an optimist, he wouldn't be where he is, would he? So that's clear. Okay, so let me stop at that point, Mike. Discussion.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Geoff. Our final speaker is Judi Greenwald. She's principal of Greenwald Consulting until January 20th, 2017. What happened on that date? She was Deputy Director for Climate, Environment, and Energy Efficiency in the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Energy Policy and System Analysis. She there oversaw technical, economic, and policy analysis related to climate mitigation and resilience, environmental protection, and energy efficiency. She has over 30 years' experience working on energy and environmental policy. Prior to joining DOE, she worked for 15 years at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, formerly known as the Pew Center on Global Climate Change, where she became the Vice President for Technology and Innovation. And prior to that, she served as a senior advisor to the White House Climate Change Task Force and a member of the professional staff of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. So please join me in welcoming Judi Greenwald.
Can you hear me? Okay, I'm going to mix things up a bit because you can't see me behind there. Who wants to see me, I'm going to stand over here. So this is the United States Mid-Century Strategy for Deep Decarbonization. If you would like to find it, it exists on the UNFCCC website. It used to exist on the White House website, but it's not there anymore. So if you want to find it, it lives and it's on the UN Framework Convention. Okay, so I'm going to start with a little bit of history and overview. Geoff mentioned a little bit of this. So in the Paris Agreement, most people know that every country who's a party has to do an NDC target or a nationally determined contribution. This was a bottom-up approach, or is a bottom-up approach to this agreement for the 2025 to 2030 timeframe. We also agreed collectively for a long-term goal of remaining well below 2 degrees Celsius. And then this is the part that not everyone knows about. The Paris Agreement also invited parties to submit mid-century low GHG strategies or greenhouse gas strategies by 2020. And so this is a picture of President Obama and Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada and President Peña of Mexico. They were working on a North American clean energy strategy, and they decided, let's go early. And Germany also decided to go early and decided to actually do our mid-century strategy, do it by November 2016 in time for the meeting in the COP22 meeting in Marrakesh. So this came out at that time as part of that meeting. Some other countries have also said that they're going early. And the idea was, it seems strange in light of recent events, the idea was that we wanted to really catalyze action. We wanted to demonstrate that this could be done. You actually could come up with a mid-century strategy. And we also hope that some of our methods and our approaches and the ideas that we had that maybe would be useful to other countries, recognizing that the whole theme of the Paris Agreement is that every country has to come up with its own strategy that's uniquely tailored to its own unique situation. We wanted to kind of jumpstart this process. So the MCS sets out a long-term vision for cost-effectively decarbonizing our economy, illustrates pathways to achieve an 80% economy-wide emission reduction by 2050. And we focused on a net emission reduction, which means net of, for example, what plants and other living things can store in terms of carbon in the physical, in the earth. So that was part of ours. So it wasn't just about the energy system. Of course, it was a lot about the energy system, but we also looked at the biological system. And similar to what other people have said, we had focused on 3 major categories of action: transitioning to a low carbon energy system, sequestering carbon through forests, soils, and CO2 removal technologies. That was a bit of a different emphasis, and reducing non-CO2 emissions such as methane, nitrous oxide, and HFC. So it's a little bit of a broader focus than some of what we've heard so far. So this is kind of it in a nutshell. This is one of these pictures that's worth 1,000 words, except it's going to take me 1,000 words to explain it. So let's see, over here, this is net emissions now. This is, or in 2005, sorry, that's the relative date that was our benchmark that we were measuring against. And it's a little bit north of 6.5 billion or 6.5 gigatons. And then this is the expected growth under a business as usual scenario. The darkest is CO2. This is methane, NTO, and the F gases or HFCs. And then this is the land sink loss that we're expecting over time. We're actually expecting, we have a pretty significant land sink in the United States, and we're expecting to lose some of it over time in a base case. So that had to be, these are up arrows. I'm not sure everybody can see that. So then all this is the down arrows that we have, that we need to get down to here, which is net emissions 80% below 2005 and 2050. So this first set was transform the energy sector, and we had energy efficiency. The lightest piece is transportation, buildings, and industry, so we're getting the most reductions in terms of transportation efficiency out of this bar. This is decarbonizing electricity, nuclear a bit, fossil fuels with carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and renewables was the biggest chunk. That's the darkest piece. That was decarbonizing electricity. And then fuel switching, we had some low carbon fuels, biofuels, and some other stuff. And then electrification was this big chunk. And of course, the electrification of these uses interacts with the decarbonization of the power sector. So you're using close to zero emitting electricity to get there. And then this land sink enhancement was pretty significant. So both the expected upside and the push to the expected getting worse, we were able to offset, at least in the way we did the modeling. This is more storage in soils, more storage of carbon in soils, better land management practices, more forests, and better farming practices. So a lot of work on federal lands. Actually, there's a lot of progress you can make there. And then non-CO2 reductions, we made some progress in the fluorinated gases, nitrous oxide, methane, and that's on CO2, and that's how we got there. So that's kind of the big story that we told. Just a little bit of scenarios around this, because these negative emissions scenarios, and actually I should go back because that's important. The CO2 removal technology is really important. So this turned out to be really important in our scenario. This was combining bioenergy combustion or gasification and use of biomass with carbon capture and storage. You usually see carbon capture and storage utilized in conjunction with fossil fuels, where you capture the CO2, there may be because biomass, at least in many circumstances, is net zero, because you take out of the atmosphere the CO2 while the biomass is growing, and then you emit it when you're combusting it or using it. On net, it's zero. So if you actually capture it and store it in geological formations, you're actually net negative emitting. So you're actually pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere on balance. So that turned out to be a really important chunk of how we got to our outcome. So given that it was so important, and it's uncertain because no one's actually using this right now, but it looks feasible, we looked at a number of scenarios around that. And this is this is historic. This was 1990 to 2014. This is CO2. This is non-CO2. This is the land sink that takes you below, and this is historic. And then here, in our benchmark scenario, this is where we were on CO2 emissions, non-CO2, the land sink, and the CO2 removal. If it turns out we couldn't do the CO2 removal, we needed to get a lot more reductions from the CO2. And then if it turned out we didn't have the ability to strengthen the land sink, then we had to get even more reductions. So we actually wound up not getting an 80% reduction in the energy sector emissions because we had some of these offsets. So that was an important outcome potentially, but uncertain. So if we don't have the help from the land sector or from these net zero emitting technologies, or the net negative emitting technologies, then the lift is harder or heavier. This is a little bit about what we did in the energy system. This is similar to what you've seen. This is the 2005 pie, the 2050 pie. This is electricity, a lot of reductions. We got more than 80% in the power sector to enable some electrification to be helpful. This is commercial buildings, residential and industry, all of that. We got significant reductions. But the bulk of the remaining emissions in the energy sector was transportation. Transportation is the hardest nut to crack. And so at least that's what we found, and I think a lot of people find this. So that's where we had most of our energy sector emissions left over. This is a slide of an image that isn't in the MCS, but this is some work that we did at DOE that fed into the MCS. And this was an important finding that we had, and it was an important message of the MCS, is that the combination of technology advances and additional policies can drive greater emission reductions than the sum of each approach on its own. We had a big emphasis in the MCS on something called mission innovation, which also seems like it happened a long time ago as well. Around the time of the Paris Agreement, 20 some odd countries, including the United States, committed to double our federal clean energy R&D over the next 5 years. And we did a fair amount of work to try to figure out, well, what might that mean? And it actually turns out that it means quite a bit. So we, this was our base case, this was our advanced technology case, and this was actually the set of assumptions that was used in the MCS strategy, where we assumed that DOE's technology programs were successful, that we actually met the cost and performance targets that we thought we could meet based on aggressive R&D. So you wind up just by itself, that gets you a significant reduction. And interestingly, it's comparable to a case where we didn't have that kind of accelerated technology innovation, which just had a carbon price of $10 per ton. So you can sort of see that you can either do policy or innovation, or if you do them both together, you actually can get fairly substantial reductions. And these down here are what we call the stretch tech case. And this was something like what would happen if you doubled our R&D budget and were successful. I mean, doubling the R&D budget by itself is not going to do it. But if we were able to meet the cost and performance targets of a much more aggressive clean energy portfolio, plus you had a policy which we represented as a carbon price, you're getting pretty low down. This line here is the 80% by 2050 line, because 2050 is out here. This is only went to 2040 for reasons I can explain if people are interested in. But so if you go out here, you're doing pretty well with a fairly combination of a modest policy and an aggressive technology innovation. So technology innovation really matters. That's a key theme of the MCS and a key theme of the work that we did. How am I doing on time? So I'm going to skip to transportation because this, I think we've talked a lot about electricity. So in our transportation strategy, I guess I shouldn't say our anymore, the MCS seems like a long time ago. So this is 2005. This is the benchmark scenario, which was kind of our core scenario, where looked at a variety of sort of a portfolio approach. We had a little bit of lots of things as opposed to emphasizing too many specific policies. In the MCS benchmark, it was very heavy reliance on the electric and hydrogen vehicles. These are passenger kilometers traveled per year. So this is how much people are moving, to just sort of see where those miles are, what's moving those miles, what kind of fuels. And so this is electric and hydrogen, this is biofuels, this is natural gas, and this is gasoline. So very, very aggressive push for electric vehicles. In this other scenario, which we call the smart growth scenario, there's a much bigger push on reducing vehicle miles traveled, which is hard to do. You know, electrification is hard. A lot of these things are hard to do. So another option is if you're worried about this, or if you think that electric vehicles is a hard lift and you want to try some other options, another way to get there is very aggressive smart growth strategies. And there we still had a lot more gasoline diesel vehicles still moving in on the electric and hydrogen vehicles, but at a somewhat slower pace. And then here's a natural gas vehicles piece. I guess one thing I want to say in conclusion is, getting to 2050, we're in 2017 now. So it seems like it's a really long way away, but it's only 33 years. And in the energy system, and even in the transportation system, it takes about 15 years for the fleet to turn over. So it's got, at 2 fleet turnovers. So it's not a lot of time. And you have we have a lot of investment in our existing energy in our existing energy system. So trying to turn that over is actually tough. And also, we're not growing that rapidly. So you don't have a lot of sort of natural turnover. So you really need to push old stuff out and bring in new stuff, and that's very challenging. And I think that I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Let me start with a question to the whole panel, which is how important is an explicit climate policy for all of this to happen? We know that Trump and Pruitt are going to wipe out the Clean Power Plan. We don't know what's going to happen with Paris, but they're clearly abandoning the INDC that was released for Paris. Not even Obama would adopt a carbon tax. How important is it that we have a climate policy to drive this, or are there going to be other things that will drive these decarbonization efforts? Jeff, do you want to start with that?
The answer is different depending on whether you're looking at electricity or transportation. I think in electricity, the decarbonisation so far, and we've seen significant decarbonisation, has been driven by market forces to a significant degree. I mean, coal is replacing gas because it's less expensive. So gas is replacing coal, sorry, because it's less expensive. And wind and solar are taking increasing market shares because they're less expensive too. The production tax credits and so on have helped, but they're not essential at this point.
And would you agree that the renewable portfolio standards were also very important in driving renewables?
Fortunately, those are state rather than federal. Yeah, I think they've been very important. At this point, I think the competitiveness of wind and solar can stand the withdrawal of the PTC and the ITC, which was happening anyway under Obama. On terms of transportation, I think the challenge is, as Judi said and I said, is significantly more difficult. We really need financial incentives for people to change from combustion engines to electric vehicles. And that could be a carbon tax, it could be financial incentives, buying electric vehicles or whatever. There's a range of things you can do there. But I think without some policy measures in that area, we'll see that going rather slow. More slowly than we would like.
I would just build on that by saying we also have the industrial sector. You also have the agricultural sector. You have the non-CO2 gases that Judi touched on. You have the land sink issue. All of these they're all important pieces, and sometimes we collectively just talk too much about the power sector and the renewables. Well, that renewable electricity, yes, is coming, and it's getting cheaper and cheaper. But yes, we ultimately need the federal government behind a set of smart policies to drive these changes. And I also just want to make one note of optimism. Which is we will survive these next 4 years. And there is a lot of momentum being generated on climate policy at the state government level, at the local government level, at the regional level, whether it's RGGI out here in the Northeast, whether it's one of the largest economies in the world, California, et cetera. And you have a lot of the business community that is not going to do a 180 on climate change. So for all those reasons, there will be some continued momentum over the next 4 years. But after that, we better get back in gear at the federal level.
So the way I think about this is that the emissions that we have are a function of three things. It's technology innovation. Thank you. The way I think about these things is that the emissions that we have are a function of three things. It's the technology innovation, it's public policy, and it's market forces. And as Geoff said, the market forces at the moment are actually helping us in the power sector because you have cheaper gas, which emits less than coal, replacing coal just through market forces. I think this is actually an important point. A lot of people talk about a war on coal, but if there is a war on coal, it's from the gas industry because that's what's been driving most of the reductions in the power sector over the past decade. We're also getting significant reductions from renewables that have historically been more policy-driven, but going forward, that's likely to also be more market-driven because the costs are coming down, in part because of these public policies and investments that we've made. Interestingly, one of the reasons that we have cheap gas now is the shale gas revolution, and one of the reasons we have a shale gas revolution is that we had some early research by the federal government and the private sector, as well as tax credits for what used to be called unconventional gas, which is now what we use quite a bit of. So these policies and that we've had and that we put in place in the long run can make a big difference as and operating through the market. So there's kind of this interplay, and innovation makes a huge difference. Luckily, in the climate space, a lot of what you want to do does have co-benefits, so you can lead with the co-benefits if you need to. Certainly energy efficiency saves money, and that helps you on climate, so you can do things for energy efficiency reasons. You can do things on renewables because you care about the other pollutants besides CO2 because they're low polluting. But it is really helpful, particularly for these very, very deep decarbonization scenarios, to have a clear idea of where you need to head and policies to get there, because it's a very hard problem. I think that's what we all have learned in our modeling exercise, that this is actually a hard problem. We can do it. I think it's feasible, and I would say that on the cost side, which I didn't talk about in terms of what the MCS said about the cost, but a key point that the MCS makes about the cost is that the costs are likely to be way less than the benefits being the cost of letting climate change happen. So I think that that's an important part of a cost conversation that was in the MCS as well. So I think it's, we really do need a climate policy, but you also can make some progress on some fronts without it.
With respect to the transport sector, how much difference do you think that the rise of autonomous vehicles are going to make in terms of the introduction of more electric power?
So this is actually another really hard problem. So DOE did some work towards the end of last year on what happens if we go all autonomous. And by 2050, depending on your assumptions, it'll either triple fuel use in light-duty vehicles are cars and light trucks, or cut it by 60%. And the range, and this is sort of looking at all the range of assumptions in the literature. And basically, the competition is between what autonomy and connectivity can do for you is they can make the whole system more efficient. You just think about your GPS on steroids. It can sort of help the whole system get people in the most efficient routes, avoid traffic. You can have a lot of ways to sort of make the system more efficient and the vehicle more efficient. But it also induces a lot more demand, because there are a lot of people who can't drive now but could be driven. And there's also a lot of people who make their decisions now as drivers, and they might make different decisions if they're being driven. Like they might tolerate being in a vehicle longer if someone else is doing the driving. So, or they might be dropped off by an autonomous vehicle, and then the vehicle goes back by itself somewhere else. So there's a huge range of uncertainty. Connectivity and automation is not being driven by energy and environment. It's being driven by safety and by mobility, access to mobility. And those are very important things that people want. But the implications for energy and environment are potentially enormous and unclear.
But that increase only happens if a lot of the autonomous vehicles still are internal combustion engines.
That is correct.
If they're all electric, then it's all of it.
Right.
I'll
half of them are electric, you'll still have quite a significant increase.
I'll briefly touch on a case study in the Risky Business report that also looks at what are the effects of autonomous vehicles. Essentially, it did half the analysis that DOE did. We just looked at a scenario of what if we have all electric vehicles and a big rise in autonomous vehicles. And similar conclusions. One is the demand for mobility services could actually go up because you are lowering the cost of people moving around. But interestingly, a phenomenon of lowering the total cost. That part of the lowering of cost comes from people not owning all their separate vehicles, but relying on companies that run the AV vehicles and using them sort of like increasing their capacity factor a lot more, and so the average price per trip goes down as opposed to heavy use of private vehicles. So bottom line is that if we go electric, this will not hurt meeting our climate goals.
Geoff indicated that he thinks that the potential for efficiency is greatly overstated in some of these reports. Karl and Judi, do you have thoughts on that?
A lot of engineering reports, I think, are hugely optimistic. in terms of their estimates of the gains from energy efficiency. There's a lot of ex-ante and ex-post studies of energy efficiency installations, and most of them find that the realized gains are a relatively small fraction of the anticipated gains ex-ante. And that's the point I'm making.
Okay.
No, it's a good question to ask, and I think I think Jeff's point is completely correct. If you look at just pure engineering studies that say what is the technical potential for increasing the efficiency of this end use, you can be misled. I know in the risky business report we looked more at nuanced studies of what kind of path can we get on gradual increase in energy efficiency. So it's not a pure engineering approach. It's more grounded in the empiricism of the last 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, I think we actually have enormous potential in buildings, and we've actually realized a fair amount of it, for example, through DOE's appliance efficiency standards. I mean, there is actually a lot of efficiency. In industry has been pretty good because they're more cost sensitive. A lot of consumers either aren't paying sufficient attention to costs, or they have don't have sufficient information. So you don't get a lot of the realized benefits without standards. The reason, which I think we've alluded to, but let me just be a little bit more explicit. In vehicles, there actually is enormous efficiency potential. I think a lot of times we don't realize it because we're fighting these low oil prices. And this is sort of this example how the transportation system, one of the reasons it's such a tough nut to crack is that you're really working against the market. You know, low oil prices means you care less about the efficiency of your vehicle. You care less about the cost of driving because oil is so cheap. So you need these efficiency standards, which are also under review by the current administration, whether that won't be maintained. But they make a huge difference. They've been a huge success story. We've saved a lot of fuel, and we've saved a lot of money, and we've avoided a lot of emissions through our fuel economy standards.
Several of the scenarios assume that all of the existing nuclear power plants, I think they're now 99 in operation, get replaced. And some of them actually assume that a lot of additional ones would be built. Given the current economics, how likely do you think that'll happen? And if it doesn't, what's going to replace that?
So some nuclear, well, there's the existing and there's the new. So we have our existing nuclear fleet, which is actually most of our zero carbon power at the moment, which most people don't realize. So if they go away, you actually get a fairly significant emissions increase unless they're replaced by other things that are zero emitting, like renewables. There are a few plants that are facing economic difficulties right now in competitive power markets, and there's a risk that they'll shut down prematurely, in which case they're most likely to be replaced by gas, which means emissions would go up. And that's why a couple of states, thus far it's Illinois and New York, have put in place policies to basically subsidize the nukes using their zero emissions credits to give them credit basically for their zero emitting characteristics. And that is a way to keep them going for a while. But eventually they will retire. There's uncertainty about how long this will take. A lot of them are getting license extensions, but there are some that won't make it. So this is an issue about what they'll be replaced with. There are a few new big nuclear plants being built. As you probably read recently, at least a couple of them are having trouble. So I think what people believe is, or what many people believe, is that there is a possible path forward for nuclear and a next generation, but they'd have to be really different from today's plants. They'd probably have to be smaller, easier to build, a lot different characteristics. And there is quite a bit of interesting innovation going on in that space. So that would be something to watch. That's certainly something I think as a country we should be investing in, because at a minimum we need that optionality.
First job I ever had was designing nuclear reactors. So I'm actually sort of basically pro-nuclear. But the economics is terrible, just terrible. If you build a new nuclear power plant today, it would probably the power would come in at around about 12 cents a kilowatt hour, which is, 4 times wind and twice coal. So the economics is hopeless. And there's 2 plants being built in the US right now by the Southern Company, and they're they're being built by Westinghouse, who just declared bankruptcy because of the cost overruns, as a way of trying to avoid the consequences of the huge cost overruns there. I mean, they're massively over budget and they're massively over timetable. And there's 2 plants being built in Europe, Olkiluoto and Flamanville, and they're both in the same situation. They're massively over budget. There's lawsuits flying everywhere. The Olkiluoto was supposed to come online 7 years ago. There's still no firm date for it to come online. So the contractors who are building these things are hopeless at this point. I think there are lots of good ideas about how to make safer and less expensive nuclear reactors. Present design of nuclear reactors was really driven by military considerations back in the 1940s and 50s. But the problem is I don't know that we're likely to invest in them. I mean, it's very, the guys in the engineering school here can go and test a new idea for a solar panel for, $500,000, $1 million, something like that. It's just not that capital intensive. If, a grad student has some smart idea about how to redesign nuclear reactors and wants to test it, it costs hundreds of millions of dollars. You get permits from everybody from the president on downwards. It's very tough to do innovation in that field at this point. So I'm not optimistic about the future of nuclear power, unfortunately. But it's it is important in many ways because, as you just heard, it's our biggest single source of carbon-free electricity right now, and that's true globally too, not just the U.S. It's true globally.
I only want to make one quick comment: is we have to be careful not to compare 4 or 5 or 6 cent the kilowatt hour solar or wind to coal or gas or nuclear. It's not apples to apples because of the storage problem that you pointed out earlier. It is still a variable intermittent source, and when you bring in what they call the firming cost to firm it up to make it an apples to apples comparison, then the economics change. But that being said, it is still true that if nuclear has any future, they need to change designs, probably need to go modular, need to bring the cost way down. Similarly, capture and sequestration right now is fairly expensive. We need R&D to bring that down. Also, a world of 100% renewables is quite a roll of the dice right now. There's credible studies that get you up to 80%. Done by NREL, but the people who put out the 100% renewable scenarios are in for some severe criticism and not really understanding what it takes to run a power system. I would close with one more thought, which is carbon capture and sequestration, I think, has a reputation among some as just a way to enable the continued production of coal. And certainly the coal industry would like CCS to be fully commercialized. But you can put coal aside and also look at, we may need CCS to put on gas plants in order to keep the power system going. We probably need CCS for industrial facilities, which we haven't figured out a way to do the industrial heat without the combustion of fossil fuels. We may need CCS for what Judi referred to, the bioenergy plants, where you could actually have a negative emission power system if you put CCS on a plant that burns biomass. So personal view is we need to continue R&D in CCS, try to bring the cost down. We should also keep the nuclear option alive in some sense to keep a good portfolio of zero and low carbon electricity sources.
Questions?
Yeah, a lot has been said about electricity production, generation. A lot has been said about transportation. Other things have sort of been mentioned. Yeah, they're important too. But while it may be the case at the very high level, global or U.S. level, if you look more regionally, you see a very different world. For instance, here in New York State, or actually most of the Northeast and up into Canada, actually heating fuel alone is responsible for over, almost twice as much CO2 emissions as all of our electrical production, including the imports. Transportation certainly is our number one source of greenhouse gas emissions, but heating fuel is a number 2. Electrical production is number 3. Given technologies like heat pumps, we can use today's electrical power with the emissions factors that it has, but when you put it through efficient heat pumps, 300, 400% efficiency, you're reducing by switching fuels, you're dramatically reducing the effective emissions rate for the electricity. Why is it that in this conversation, particularly when we have such a large part of the country where heating fuel alone is such an important source of greenhouse gas emissions, why is it that the discussion of CO2 almost never refers to anything other than electricity production and transportation at best? Why is basic needs of our region so much ignored in this conversation?
Very, very good question. And if you dig into the details of our report, and I think also the MCS report, you will see that both oil and gas for used in space conditioning and hot water heating need to be phased out over these 30 years and switched precisely to what you're putting your finger on, which is heat pumps. So you'll see in our scenarios the gradual phase out of oil and gas combustion for space heat and domestic water heating in buildings.
Yeah, that's always in the footnotes of the reports. All the reports say it in the footnotes. Why doesn't it get higher visibility? Why don't you say it in your presentations, not just in your footnotes? Or
Okay, well, it is in there, and
Yes, not just the footnotes, but in a 10-minute presentation, I think one tends to focus on the 2 or 3 main sources. But you're quite right. Heat pumps are massively underappreciated in the U.S.
in back.
Yes, you mentioned in passing the importance of the transportation problem, but I don't feel that it was really placed, given the importance that it actually has. Currently, there are nearly 2 billion automobiles on the road in the world, and they're held by a very varied social class index of people. You have the very wealthy that can afford to buy a Tesla because it's replaced the Rolls-Royce as a car of leisure. And there are those who basically drive jalopies in third world countries, well, they'll replace parts with other parts and they'll just continue driving. So there needs to be, I think you need to address the viability of alternative conversion technologies, which do exist, and which are being crowded out by this faith in the electric car. First comment. Second comment, the electric car is dependent on fuel cells. And these fuel cells, lithium, is not a finite material in the planet. It's a very rare earth material. How does one deal with that?
Thank you.
Well, I mean, there are alternatives to lithium. I mean, the next generation of batteries will probably use magnesium rather than lithium. There's very similar electrochemical properties. But lithium actually is more abundant than you might think. Just we haven't been looking for it until recently. I think your first point, I think it's very important. I mean, both Judi and I said that the average life of a vehicle in the US is 15 years. Which is true. But what we didn't say is that it probably then gets shipped to a third world country where it gets used for another 15 years. So these cars hang around for an awfully long time. And yes, I mean, getting rid of the stock of fuel inefficient vehicles is a major challenge. None of us really addressed that. And it's not totally clear how you do that. I mean, a carbon tax is one way of doing that.
Well, there are also hydrogen technologies that exist that are being crowded out.
Well, you can. I mean, yeah. The simplest adjustment probably is to convert them to natural gas. That's not enormously expensive. In fact, in quite a lot of third world countries, you find things like taxis and so on running on natural gas. So you can do that, and that reduces the emissions somewhat. But ultimately, you've got to get them off fossil fuels totally, and that I think requires quite a stiff tax on fossil fuels.
So a couple of the broad points you made are worth elevating, which is that this discussion is focused on the U.S. What can the U.S. do, and that's the idea. In every country, it's going to look a bit different, but we do have to think globally, and the solutions elsewhere might be different. I actually am also very interested in hydrogen. Hydrogen is a little bit tougher in some ways. I mean, electrification has a bunch of issues. A lot of sort of people who are really into automobiles think hydrogen's a much better fuel. A lot of the companies would actually prefer to be going hydrogen, but we don't have a hydrogen refueling infrastructure, whereas we have a lot of electricity wires going around. And you'd need a recharging infrastructure that would be somewhat different, but it builds on a very elaborate electric infrastructure. So sort of what the existing infrastructure is that you have can be very important. So I could actually imagine other countries, say China, going more on hydrogen, and maybe that would propagate from there. So there's lots of different potential solutions. And I guess I'd emphasize a point that I think it's very important that we pursue all of these somewhere, and it's going to be a little bit different in different countries. Okay, I'll
We
stop.
just have a couple of minutes, but Nilda?
I just wanted to sort of add a little bit to what the point that you were making, which is in New York City, the greenhouse gas emissions profile is about 70% buildings, 20% transportation, 7% waste. And within that profile in the buildings, the majority of greenhouse gas emissions that we found when we were doing the analysis at the city came from heat and hot water from buildings. And so to the extent, and I don't think that that profile is all that different from other sort of aging cities in the northern part of the country. We're a bit more dense here than some other cities, but still. So I just wanted to kind of add a little bit more information to what you were saying, as it relates to here. But also, I was interested that it seemed like your projections of hydropower were relatively stable throughout that time. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, because it's one thing that, certain cities have been really going, especially in the West, have been really ramping up their dependence on hydro.
A little bit more being about 30 seconds.
Yeah. I'm going to just leave it at that.
Yeah, there's not potential for a lot of expansion of hydropower, on any significant basis in the U.S. If anything, we're starting to take some dams down to restore fisheries. So there's things that can be done here and there, and there's maybe some run-of-the-river technologies that can be used. But in terms of a big contribution to zero carbon electricity, just not much potential.
There's enormous potential for bringing it down from Canada. And there's a lot of surplus capacity in Canada. That's all a matter
They would love
of
to sell it.
transmission, and they would love to sell it. And part of the replacement for Indian Point is related to that. Well, we are regrettably out of time. We could go on for another hour, but we can't. I want to thank our panelists for a terrific